Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
And greetings. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. And I'd like to introduce my guest today. We have on board Mr. David Eisenberg, who is president of Anresco Laboratories. And, you know, as part of my job as the natural nurse, I do a lot with the nutraceutical industry, and those are companies, and by the way, there's a lot of very, very big, major ones right here on Long Island that make nutritional supplements. And one of my jobs with them is help them get in touch with people who can do the best laboratory procedures to assure that everything they are selling is really clean. And one of the big things that we are testing for, and sometimes it's not even mandated, but some of these companies are taking it on as their own responsibility, is to test for things like glyphosate, which is also known as Roundup, and it's on a lot of genetically modified products like we have talked about in the past, and other kinds of pesticide and herbicide residues left over in food and supplements and where you don't really want it. So as part of that, I have been investigating various kinds of laboratories, and that is how I met our guest today, Dr. David Eisenberg, and he is the president of Anresco Laboratories. So, David, thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest today, right here on Herbally Yours.
Well, Ellen, thank you so much for having me. I have to correct you, though. I only have an MBA from Wharton. I've worked in the at Anresco 45 years, though, so I have some experience in the analytical laboratory industry.
Yes, well, of course, and you run it, and it was started by your father, which you shared with me, Dr. Sylvan Eisenberg, Ph.D. in chemistry from Stanford. So that's another thing that really influenced my decision to invite you on, because I think it's such a wonderful family business story, which is, you know, just very American.
Well, yes, my father was born and grew up in New York. He grew up in the Catskill Mountains, going to a one-room schoolhouse, and then eventually got his Ph.D. in physical chemistry from Stanford, and he founded Anresco in 1943.
So that's very, very inspirational. And I know that right away he was working on things like testing. So you guys go way back in that industry.
Yes, well, the beginning is in food testing in the baking industry, especially for nutrients and components of interest necessary to assure proper manufacturing.
The other thing that interested me is you yourself worked in the nonprofit sector after you got, an MBA from Wharton is not something that everybody gets. So you worked hard for that. It is well recognized. You certainly could have gone sort of right to a big Wall Street company, but instead you worked for nonprofits organizing and funding minority-owned businesses in Brooklyn and Alaska? David,
yeah.
What does that mean, Brooklyn and Alaska?
Well, it was... I thought it was a great, fun experience. The 3 years I lived in New York were marvelous, working for the Bedford-Stuyvesant Corporation. But then I was, out of the blue, offered a job up in Alaska, and I said I don't really like cold weather, but it was a great opportunity for me to bring some of the experience that I'd had in Brooklyn and apply it in a new setting. And it was quite exciting being in Alaska, and the situation was quite different than Brooklyn, and the thought processes and the attitudes of the people were quite different.
But it's absolutely beautiful that you actually spent your time, working in that kind of venue, really helping people get started in minority-owned businesses. I just think that was another thing that interested me about your past and your path.
Well, I learned many ways you could get into trouble in business, and a few ways that had a likelihood of success. So I think I learned far more than I gave, and it was a great experience.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, Anresco, and that's ANRESCO, correct? Is that how we spell that?
Yes, that's correct. It stands for Analysis Research Consulting. It's the name that my father came up with when he went into business.
And when early on, you actually were accredited with the USDA. Now, what does the USDA have to do with businesses like you where we're testing for residues?
Well, USDA did have an accreditation program testing for nutrients and also testing for contaminants in meat products. The contaminants included pesticide residues, PCBs, some drug residues. And since Anresco was involved in the food industry, we sought and we achieved accreditation under that program. Of course, so what happened was initially the program was at no charge, but then the government started charging $5,000 per category to be accredited, and we handed back our accreditation maybe 10 years ago because we weren't doing that much work that required the USDA accreditation.
Oh, that's interesting. And you had shared with me also over the years the government's attitude towards testing, deep testing for things like pesticides and herbicides seems to fluctuate in terms of their not only implementation but carrying out that kind of testing.
Well, yes, that's certainly been my experience. In 2009, I gave testimony before the House Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee relating to the FDA regulation of food imports and deficiencies that I thought and improvements that I thought could be made. And some of the comments I made wound up being embedded in the Food Safety Modernization Act provisions, which passed in January of 2011. Unfortunately, some of those provisions of the Act have not been implemented even now by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So even though it may be the law of the land, if it's not being enforced, then it really has no effect.
Well, I'd like to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and my guest today is Mr. David Eisenberg, who is president of Anresco Labs. You can always find out more at anresco.com, and of course we'll have that link on our archive like we always do. So that was very interesting what you just shared, David, that there are certain regulations, but they're not always upheld. How does that affect people's health and wellness, do you think?
Well, it's very difficult to establish cause and effect for pesticide residues or in fruit or vegetables or food products or drug residues in meat, poultry, eggs, because usually there's if the effect may be a very long-term effect, it may trigger cancer or something that might develop 5 or 10 years later. The issues that have a direct, immediate cause and effect are microbial contamination, such as E. coli or Salmonella, Listeria.
Wow, you're talking about things those are really hot words right now, David. Thank you for sharing them because we're sort of hearing that on the news all the time. What do you think's going on? Is it happening more now, or is it just being caught more because there's additional testing, or what's up with that? So often now we're hearing things even like lettuce and organic produce has either E. coli, Salmonella, or another infective organism.
Well, I doubt that the incidence of such contamination is increasing. I think it's probably public awareness and better functioning of regulatory authorities when people do complain and report a problem.
Well, that's good, and that certainly sounds like it really makes sense that there's sort of better follow-up. And so we're able to track it, where before, without the internet and without so much communication, somebody in a community might have gotten ill, but we didn't know it also happened in 5 other places.
Well, I think there's been a continual, gradual improvement in control of pathogens in foods, and there are provisions of the Food Safety Modernization Act which require something very similar to HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, to be implemented by U.S. food manufacturers and by foreign food manufacturers also.
Well, as you know, because you work closely, let's say, with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has had its own mishigase lately, all kinds of political upheavals, but we're not so interested in that. But does the EPA regulations affect your testing? Like, who do you report your test results to?
Well, because certain of the provisions of Food Safety Modernization Act have not been implemented, which relates to the Food and Drug Administration. We report our results directly to the Food and Drug Administration, but also to our clients. And the analytical work and the sampling work that we do is the property of our clients. And if our client advises us not to report it to the FDA, we don't necessarily report it because the FDA does not require it.
Right. It's not required, and also it's not, let's say, contracted by the FDA. It might be contracted by a private group.
We're working for an importer. We're not working for the FDA.
Right, and many times, in fact, a lot of those things are actually unregulated. So although a manufacturer may want to know, I know the ones that I work with want to know information about pesticide and glyphosate residue that's actually above and beyond what's required. So they would work with a laboratory like you to find out, because they are personally interested, and they also want to make that claim so that their clients know that that testing is being done.
Well, there are many wonderfully, highly ethical and honest food manufacturing companies and cannabis manufacturing companies making edible products who absolutely want their products to be safe and the best possible, and they will go certainly beyond what is mandated by the regulatory authorities.
Well, we're going to take a little break right here, David, and you brought up a hot term that we'll come back to there, cannabis. And I want you to know, listeners, that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live online at nccradio.org or on iHeartRadio. For more information on today's guest or topic, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. Stay tuned. Herbally Yours will be right back.
Hey everybody, Rachel Ray here. Nothing puts a bigger smile on my face than cooking up a big meal for family and friends. But there's not enough room at my table for the 17 million kids in America who are struggling with hunger. These children, that's 1 out of every 5, often have to skip meals because there's just nothing to eat in the kitchen. Yet there's more than enough healthy, nutritious food produced right here in America to feed every last hungry child. If only there was a way to get it to them. That's why the Feeding America nationwide network of food banks collects surplus food to give hope to hungry kids and their families all across our country. But they can't do it without your help. Join me in supporting Feeding America at your local food bank and at feedingamerica.org. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're Feeding America.
A message from Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Welcome back once again to Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. And we are talking with our guest today, Mr. David Eisenberg, the president of Anresco Laboratories. And he's really sharing some very high-level information